It is now time for the death metal lore iceberg chart. Ah, yes, the iceberg chart template. One of my personal favorites to do here on my YouTube channel that I've done quite a handful already, as some of you guys are aware of. But what makes this one a little bit different here is that it's going to be the death metal's lore. So unlike other charts where I focus on albums or bands and their overall sounds that compiles that chart, we're going to be focusing on death metal's history, the stories, the behind the scenes scenarios of certain bands and artists that can range from either the well-known to the obscure and unheard. And typically these stories can come out sounding either, absurd and insane and crazy, to some others that can be quite humorous and comedic. And then of course, as we go down, some of them can be kind of mysterious and disturbing. Before we get started, two quick things I want to address here. First being that this iceberg chart is going to contain 6 tiers, and like always, I categorize them by a certain theme to help organize all of the lore that's within this video. And the second being, I want to give a massive thank you to everyone that helped expand this video, as over the past week on my personal Instagram and on my YouTube community post, I asked you guys if there was any other stories or wild scenarios that you guys could tell me relating to death metal, and a lot of you guys helped out. So as this video progresses on and I get to all of the different entries and stories here, as I promised, I'll make sure to credit the individuals that helped expand this iceberg all the more. In traditional fashion, we obviously start this iceberg chart at the top, that being tier 1, which I called Death Metal 101. To be blunt, I'm going to go through this tier really quickly, as the title for the tier implies. It's Death Metal 101. All of the basic stuff. If you know what death metal is overall, you should know everything I'm going to be talking about here, as you can learn it from a really basic death metal history video here on YouTube to glazing over some paragraphs on a Wikipedia page. I'll start this off with the description of death metal itself, as death metal is an extreme metal subgenre that came forth around the early to mid 80s. It was greatly influenced by thrash metal of the early 80s, only it took it to the next level in terms of aggression, as the guitar riffs are a bit more tuned down, the vocals have a rougher sound to it, almost more in the sense now of growls and death growls, as people call it, and the drumming and overall tempo seems to be a lot faster as blast beats start being utilized more frequently. The lyrics and themes of death metal is a reflection of its sound, as it's quite explicit and transgressive. Most of the time when you come across death metal albums, the album artwork and its lyrical themes will have things to do with blood, guts, gore, violence. Most of the time even they are inspired by horror movies. To other times you'll come across forms of like Satanism is kind of depicted on album artworks, pentagrams are utilized quite frequently, and at other occurrences, themes such as destruction, Armageddon, and war is another recurring theme. Chuck Schuldiner. What more needs to be said here, as he's widely considered to be the godfather of death metal itself. He was with death metal from its inception from the early to mid 80s up until his death in 2001, and the band that he fronted, Death, would really revolutionize and evolutionize death metal as we know it, from all the different eras of death, starting off more in the traditional sense of death metal with a little bit of a thrash edge with the first 3 albums, to progressively adding in more progressive songwriting types of ideas that was a little bit technical at times too, when you get to the early to late 90s of that particular era. Just overall, when it comes to the history and the scene of death metal, Chuck Schuldiner's name is just inescapable. Possessed 7 Churches, released in 1985, is often considered to be the first ever death metal full-length album, and Possessed themselves are widely considered to be the first ever death metal band. as there's a little bit dispute there between Possessed and Death. Regardless though, the influence of Possessed on death metal itself is undeniable, as even their vocalist Jeff Becerra is widely considered to be another godfather figure for death metal as a whole. The Florida death metal scene, or as some call it, the Floridian death metal scene, is widely considered to be one of the big hotspots that really helped flesh out what we know of death metal today, as bands started popping through around the late 80s and early 90s. Noticeable names obviously would be Death, Cannibal Corpse, which I know they're from New York, but they moved to Florida, so some consider them to be a Floridian death metal band. Deicide, Obituary, Morbid Angel, the list goes on and on and on, and just so many heavy hitters that again are just staples for death metal as we know it today. And other than that, the only other thing to point out with Floridian death metal is one thing that is distinct about them, with the names at least that I brought up, is I always felt like the Floridian death metal scene for its time was like the heaviest of the bunch, focusing more on aggression, speed, and brutality. That is, certain characteristics with death metal that regardless of what age group or demographic, new or old, of being a death metal fan is something you would look for. The Swedish death metal scene is equally as important for the development for death metal as the Floridian death metal scene. Bands were popping through around the same time, around the late 80s and early 90s, making waves. Obviously, staple names for the Swedish death metal scene would be Dismember, Unleashed, Entombed, and Grave. What's a little bit different about the Swedish death metal sound from the Floridian death metal sound is while they're not as heavy or fast-paced, they make it up with their overall sound being a little bit more cryptic and atmospheric, having some forms of melancholy and atmosphere, really make their sound something quite unique. Scott Burns was a music producer that played a vital role into how we just basically identify the production value and sound of death metal as a whole, as his work during the early 90s is most of which being with a lot of the Floridian death metal bands I just talked about a few minutes ago, that even though there is a plethora of music producers out there that have put in their work and have their own signature spin when it comes to the production value within death metal alone, Scott Burns is just such a legendary name when you realize just how many albums he's worked on that are considered to be like classic and essentials for death metal as we know it. That he's like the must-know music producer to understand death metal, that made it such a noticeable characteristic with the production value. And finally, closing out Tier 1, what's playing in the background of this video is Intestine Balsam with their third full-length album, Ultimate Instinct. Fun fact about these guys, legend has it, if you listen to them on a regular basis daily, your music taste tends to be superior to others. Moving on down a level in this Iceberg chart to Tier 2, which is called Death Metal 102. From here on out, going through this Iceberg chart becomes really fun for me, at least anyway, as in this tier, talking about Death Metal 102, we're going to be discussing death metal's relationship with pop culture references, other individuals that are quite significant to the development for death metal overall, to other stories that are quite humorous that for the most part are well known among the death metal scene and its peers. Dan Seagrave. Besides having a really badass last name, Dan Seagrave is a self-taught painter who has done work for so many death metal album artworks over the years for bands such as Morbid Angel, Pestilence, Suffocation, Carnage, and Benediction, just to name a few, that it's very recognizable and distinct. And I would say out of all of the artists out there that have done work for the visuals for death metal album artworks, Dan Seagrave seems to be regarded as some of the best. Vincent Locke, an artist and illustrator known for creating artwork that's very grotesque, ultra-violent, gory, with themes to do with zombies, but is mainly known in the death metal world for doing the album artwork for every single Cannibal Corpse full length from their debut to their most recent. George Corpsegrinder Fisher is the current vocalist for the death metal band Cannibal Corpse, when he joined back in 1995, replacing the original vocalist Chris Barnes. One distinct quality about him physically that a lot of people tend to point out is that he has a very thick neck. And apparently on his personal Instagram, George Corpse Grinder, he has a fascination playing a lot of claw machine arcade games and seems to be quite successful at playing them, as he tends to have a lot of winnings with all the photos that he posts of stuffed animals and plushies. Chris Garza, the guitar player to that for the deathcore band Suicide Silence. He's mentioned here because he has a podcast called Garza Podcast, where most of the time he interviews extreme metal musicians, some of which being in bands playing in the style of death metal, that for most people, his podcast is considered to be the closest thing we have to a high-budget death metal podcast. Metalocalypse was an adult animated television show that aired on Adult Swim. It premiered in 2006 and it ran for 4 seasons. And it also follows the band Deathlock, which would actually release albums to the public, which I'll be talking about them a little bit later on in this video as we go down the iceberg. But if you are a death metal fan, chances are you know of this show, as you pay attention to the writing and what's being presented on each episode. There's a lot of nods and homages to a lot of death metal cliches that only metal fans would understand. That in terms of its writing and humor, it's very well done. Speaking about Adult Swim, in 2016, they were at the Maryland Death Fest. They had their own booth at that festival. And speaking off of experience, because I couldn't find any photos of them being there, but what they were doing was trying to promote their new show at the time, Mr. Pickles. And what workers at Adult Swim were doing was they had a camera and you could take a photo in this seat with a statue of the dog, Mr. Pickles, to again just help promote their show. But I just thought it was really cool that Adult Swim was at a death fest out of all things to promote a show. The Jane Pratt Show was a very short-lived talk show that started and ended in the year 1993. But one thing I think it is known for, because it is such a fever dream to just see, is that on one episode they had a discussion about police brutality, and in this discussion was Tupac and David Vincent from Morbid Angel. And as I stated, just seeing these two interact with each other, it just doesn't look real. Deicide, formerly known as Amon, back in 1988 did a PBS fundraiser, and the song that they played for this fundraiser was Sacrificial Suicide. That, again, this is just another weird occurrence of a death metal band being in the public's eye. Alright, for the rest of this tier, I'm going to go in rapid fire of all different death metal bands that have been affiliated with different forms of pop culture and media, whether it be from television, movies, and video games. The brutal death grind band Mortician was featured in the soundtrack for the 1997 film Gummo, which I find quite interesting that this experimental drama film arguably has the most metal soundtrack you'll ever come across, as Mortician is one of the many extreme metal bands featured on it. In the 1994 comedy Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, Cannibal Corpse is in this movie playing Hammer Smash Face. You already all knew this. In the American sitcom Friends, the death grind band Carcass gets a name drop, because apparently in terms of context, one of the characters is discussing one of the bands that they want playing for their wedding, and another character states that for their wedding, their husband wanted the heavy metal band Carcass to play. The 2010 video game Splatterhouse, with their launch trailer, the song by the death thrash band Goatwhore, Apocalyptic Havoc, plays. In the 2008 video game Rock Band 2, in the set list, there is a brutal death metal band called Abnormality with their single Visions that is in the game. And it turns out the reason as to how that song got into this game is that the vocalist for Abnormality, Malika, she worked in the development team for this game. Thus, that's how she got her band single in it, which is one hell of a way to promote your band. In 2009, The Witcher: Rise of the White Wolf was planned to be released as an RPG video game. However, it ended up being cancelled. But what's interesting is for the soundtrack for this game, the Polish death thrash band Vader wrote a song for it, that being The Sword of the Witcher. The brutal death metal band Suffocation was featured in a commercial for the History Channel when they were promoting their show The Dark Ages. In the second episode of the 23rd season for South Park, Banned in China, 2 death metal songs were used, that for the band's Death Decline with their song Useless Sacrifice, and Dying Fetus with their song Second Skin. Closing out Tier 2 is without a shadow of a doubt the funniest and most random out of all of the pop culture references relating to death metal. But Chris Barnes, at this point now the vocalist for 6 Feet Under, was featured in a car commercial for the Park Auto Mall in Tampa, Florida, which in this short little commercial he promotes 6 Feet Under and talks about his recent purchase from that dealership, that being a 2003 Porsche, which is just like the most random thing ever to come across on the internet. But credits go to Abhorrent Studios for helping remind me of this. With the conclusion of Tier 2, we move down an additional level to Tier 3, this all being about figures. In this particular tier, we're going to be focusing on numbers having to do with album sales, ages, firsts, anything that has to do referring to numbers and counting all applies to this for death metal. From what is listed online, the highest selling death metal album would be Morbid Angel Covenant, selling a little over 127,000 units. However, this isn't entirely accurate anymore, as if you search up this topic online about the highest selling death metal album, the information provided only goes up to the year of 2003. So after 20 plus years of time passing, it's easy to assume those figures have greatly changed. And for all we know, the title for the highest selling death metal album might go to something completely different if it ever gets updated. As for the highest selling death metal band, that would go to Cannibal Corpse, as it's estimated back in 2015, their record sales have exceeded over 2 million. As for what is listed for the highest charted death metal album on the Billboard 200, that would be Deathlock with their album Death Album 3, as it peaked at number 10. The death metal band with the largest discography in terms of releases such as full lengths, EPs, demos, splits, etc. would be Nunslaughter, as it's listed on Discogs. Their discography in terms of releases, the count goes up to 242. From what I was able to find, the death metal band with the largest lineup would go to Haggard. And on their album Awakening the Centuries, from what I was able to count on the main lineup, there was 20 individuals, and on the guest session, there was 16 other guest musicians. So in terms of a total count of a lineup on this album, that would be 3 dozen musicians taken apart on one album. And the reason why Haggard has such a massive lineup with any album and just overall is that it's a death metal band that has elements of progressive death metal and the effect of a symphony orchestra playing over everything. Thus you have all these different musicians coming and going with all these other instrumentations of a symphony orchestra. So I think it's a huge reason as to why when it comes to a lineup as the largest, Haggard takes that title. The youngest death metal musician would be Joni Young. She was a vocalist for the death grind band Sockweb. Born in 2007, Sockweb's debut release was an EP called Bullies Are Mean, released in the year 2013. Meaning Joni Young was only 6 years old doing vocals for a death grind band. As for the oldest death metal musician, This is a little complicating, because if you search up the oldest death metal musician or anything like that on a search engine, all results will point to this woman in Ginsberg, who was 94 years young, performing in a metal band for vocals. And I wouldn't necessarily call this death metal, me being all kind of like nerdy and dorky right now, because it doesn't have any death metal growls. The instrumentation's not in that vein. It's still a metal band, no doubt about it, and it's still impressive that a 94-year-old is performing vocals. God bless her freaking soul. But I don't know if we can really conclude her as the oldest in death metal. Definitely in metal overall she is, but maybe not death metal. The other answer could be the County Medical Examiners, a death grind, gore grind band that started in the year 2001. And as you can see in the band photo, the dude in the middle stands out quite a bit, as supposedly this guy is a part of this band, his name being Guy Radcliffe, and it's stated that he joined the band in 2001 to do backing vocals and play bass guitar, and that he was at the age of roughly 60 when he started, and the last thing that they would release would be an album in 2007. So it's estimated that if this is all legit, Guy Radcliffe was 66 years old playing bass and doing backing vocals for a death grind, gore grind band. The problem with all of this is that it's rumored that a lot of this is fabricated just to get, like, clout and people talking about this band more. So nothing's really set in stone as to whether or not this is actually true. The only other answer that I can give you for what is considered to be the oldest death metal musician would be Carl Sander from Nile, as he is right now 62 years young. The only other thing I can add with Carl Sanders here is that in terms of the metal archives, he's the first ever musician inducted into that website. The death metal band that has remained active the longest with no disbanding, hiatuses, or name changes would be Vader, as they formed back in the year 1983 and have remained active still to this day. Another bit of nerdy information is that according to the Metal Archives, out of all the genres listed on that website, death metal has the highest count right now, a little over 63,900, and it continues to grow every day. This next inclusion might be a little bit of a cheat on my end, so feel free to disagree with me here. But from what I was able to find, the longest death metal album would come from Swallowed the Sun with their 3-part album, Songs from the North, as altogether it clocks in, I believe, at 2 hours, 33 minutes, and 45 seconds. The reason why this is a little bit of a cheat on my end is that even though they play in the style of death doom, a majority of this album is done playing in the style of either doom metal or funeral doom. So it's not like fully death metal, so again, if you want to disagree with me on this one, I totally understand. Closing up this tier, the last 2 inclusions are considered to be first for death metal, starting it off with Brujeria with their 1990 demo. This is widely considered to be the first death metal release that the lyrics aren't in English, which I find quite interesting that it took almost a full decade since the inception of this genre to have a release be in non-English. And Lori Bravo, the vocalist for the death grind band Nuclear Death, is widely considered to be the first woman involved with anything that has to do with being in an extreme metal band. Moving on down another level in this Iceberg chart to tier 4, that being Anomalies. In this tier, we're going to be focusing on more obscure and lesser known stories that aren't talked about as much within the death metal community. That most of these are going to come off sounding very outlandish and ridiculous. Some others might be quite humorous, and a few of these sound kind of dangerous. I'll start it off with probably the most known one, that being Cannibal Corpse versus Germany, Australia, and Russia, as there was a ban on a lot of their albums. I believe it's the first 4 albums, all with Chris Barnes, that had this big, ban that they couldn't even play the albums if they were to tour in those countries. that it was a big question on censorship and freedom of art and stuff like that. But Cannibal Corpse is no stranger to controversy, especially when it comes to their lyrical themes and their album artwork that's gotten them into some deep water. But at the same time, it really has benefited them because of that controversy. It's just gotten people to talk about them all the more. An event similar to this would happen to Dismember, as in 1991 they got in a legal battle with the courts of the United Kingdom, as I believe when they toured that area, Customs got a hold of some of their merchandise, that being of the album Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. There's a song on it called Skin Her Alive, and because of this explicit song title, the UK courts tried suing Dismember for having indecent and obscene content with their albums, only for them to lose that case. What I find interesting about this, however, with this controversy, is that Dismember would follow it up in 1993 with their album Indecent and Obscene, which they named it after this whole legal battle with the UK courts. Quite a handful of you guys told me to include this story in this video. But in 1990, after the release of Spiritual Healing, Death was supposed to go on a European tour. It's just during that time, Chuck Schuldiner, the mastermind behind Death, had dissatisfaction with the band, organization, and event, and decided not to travel to Europe to perform, leaving the remaining band members along with the roadies to carry out that tour and perform. After that tour was done, Chuck Schuldiner fired all of the members and carried on with Death with a new lineup. What I find interesting about this is, from everything we can recollect with Death, from music videos, band photos, Death as a whole, every album, just anything that has to do with this band, Chuck Schuldiner is the face of it. I mean, every live performance you can find online is always just him front and center. And I find it quite interesting that this is supposedly like the only time in the history of Death where Chuck Schuldiner wasn't a part of the band in some kind of a way. Malevolent Creation, They Breed. Yeah. If you know why this is included, it's because you know of its infamy. As Malevolent Creation is typically known for having lyrical themes of all the cliches in death metal, yet with this one song, if you look at the lyrics, on the last verse, they drop the N-word with a hard R, and that's why it's a song that's considered to be incredibly infamous. And from what I was able to search up as to why this happened, not like it's trying to justify it, is that supposedly Malevolent Creation at this time had a member that's not with them anymore, that let's say his vocabulary was a little bit looser compared to the everyday man, and during one of their recording sessions they got robbed of all of their gear, and to showcase the most unhinged frustration and anger that they were feeling from that event, they decided, or at least not they, but one of the members that used to be with them decided, let's write a song like this, here are the lyrics, and they performed it. So yeah, Malevolent Creation, They Breed, as I stated, like one of the most infamous death metal songs you can find. Lord Worm was the original vocalist for the technical brutal death metal band Cryptopsy. And the reason as to why his stage name is Lord Worm is apparently he had a fascination with eating insects. And at some of his shows when he performed for Cryptopsy, for a stage antic, he would eat worms. Hence why his stage name is Lord Worm. Autopsy, Maryland Death Fest 2022. This is a very infamous performance, and I was there and I witnessed it, sadly. But as the story goes, as I can give you a first-hand experience here, is that Autopsy performed their set as usual. They didn't do anything wrong. It's just the individuals in the audience did something quite infamous. As the story goes, in the circle pit, one man decided to lay on his back and have a girl sit on his face and urinate in his mouth. And from what I remember witnessing as I was just outside the corner of that circle pit, is seeing everyone mosh all crazy as people do, and then it abruptly stopped, and people just stared in disbelief and disgust witnessing this. And from what I also heard, as I had a friend there who knew the guy that was willing to let that girl do that, is supposedly my friend saw that man come out of the porta-john and yelled to my friend stating, "I'm gonna let this girl piss on me. I just took a bunch of drugs," and ran into the pit and did that event. So yeah. Alright, so this next inclusion is one I wanted to include because I've always considered this to be like the most unintentional troll interview you can find relating to death metal. But if you search up on YouTube Portal interview, you would think you would get the Portal death metal band from Australia. However, what ends up happening is you will get an interview of the band Portal, but it's a pop rock band. And I just love watching it from time to time because the like to dislike ratio is like super negative, and all the comments are like, this isn't the right Portal, this isn't the Portal we're looking for. And again, just in terms of face value, I just always found this to be like an unintentional troll interview because you are getting the Portal interview, just not the Portal you're looking for. Glenn Benton is quite the figure when it comes to death metal frontmen, which I'm very aware from everything you guys comment in the community posts. There's so much I could include here from what he's said and done. However, what I am going to include is what I consider to be the most outlandish thing he ever claimed. As during, I believe, the early 90s, when he was roughly around like his mid to late 20s, he would state in interviews that when he reached the age of 33, he was going to take his own life, as it was in reference to Jesus Christ dying on the cross when he was at the age of 33, again out of spite and showcasing his anti-Christian and pro-satanic views. It's just, from what we can tell as of today, that never happened. Old Funeral was a Norwegian death metal band, mainly fronted by Abath from Immortal, but I wanted to include it here because for a short while, Varg, who's known for being in the project Burzum, used to play guitar on this. And if you search up Old Funeral live, you can find live footage of Varg performing in a live band, which I believe is like the only occurrence that is available online that is at least known with Varg. So I find that just kind of funny and interesting that Varg, such an infamous figure in black metal, was shortly involved with death metal, and this is what it ended up being. Steve Hughes is an Australian comedian and actor known as the heavy metal humorist, as a lot of his comedy sketches that you can find online have to do with heavy metal subculture, basically. But he's also a drummer, and he's actually drummed for quite a handful of extreme metal bands in the Australian scene, such as Sadistic Execution, as I believe he was the original drummer for them, along with Slaughterlord, both bands kind of blending forms of black metal, death metal, and thrash metal together. It's also highly speculated from rumors that he also performed for the band Portal once or twice apparently, but there's no concrete evidence, as again Portal always plays their shows as these anonymous cloaked figures. But considering the fact that he's a drummer from Australia, there is somewhat of a connection there, but again there's no concrete proof. Credits to my Instagram follower KingQuinn244 for telling me about this next inclusion. But Autechre, the experimental electronic group that has done some really boundary pushing stuff within their discography, did a album called, I think, Fact Mix 122. All of these different remixes by all different like metal, electronic, and experimental artists. One of which they did a remix to, that being Necrophagus's Diminished to Be. Hatebeak is a death grind band fronted by an African grey parrot. As what you're going to hear from any of their material online is the instrumentation of death grind with a parrot screeching over it, basically. And what's really funny, if you go through their discography, is some of the splits that they did would be with other death grind bands but play on words. For example, they did a split with Birdflesh, the Swedish death grind band, and their last release that they did is they did a split with this band called Boar Glue. And what Boar Glue is another death grind band fronted by 3 guinea pigs. Eat the Turnbuckle is a death thrash band based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that is all about professional wrestling, from their lyrical themes, presentation, album artwork, and aesthetics from start to finish. It's just, the reason why I'm including them here is that they're all about professional wrestling, and I'm not talking about WWE, WCW, or AEW. I'm talking like underground deathmatch wrestling is what they're all about. And one of their guitarists, I believe, he actually is a professional wrestler as well. It's just, the reason why I'm including them here is from all of their live performances that they do, and you can find it here on YouTube, is they'll perform their music in the style of death thrash. It's just, what also ends up happening is some of the band members, along with other wrestlers, will participate in death matches as the band is playing. So you're witnessing a death metal band playing, and there's all of this like death match type of hardcore wrestling going on, with weapons being used, people being thrown all over the place. All of the participants are just like smeared in blood from being cut open. It's just absolutely crazy stuff to watch. Cannabis Corpse is a very well-known parody death metal band that, from their presentation, album artwork, album titles, song titles, and lyrics, all has to do with play on references to death metal, but it's replaced with pothead lingo, basically. That if you enjoy death metal and you're a pothead, this is like a must-know band. For this next inclusion, credits go to Cosmic Bombardment for reminding me about this. But yep, Bolt Thrower had a fight break out in one of their live performances, as back in 1991 they would do a tour with Mortal Decay and Crucifier. I'll have a link provided in the description to the live performance, as it's kind of hard to come by here on YouTube. But roughly around the halfway point of their set, one of the audience members got a bit rowdy and started shouting, harassing, and basically causing conflict between other audience members and the band Bolt Thrower, as supposedly this individual was part of this skinhead, far right-wing, neo-Nazi kind of movement at that bar where they typically would hang out. And going to his spot and seeing a band like Bolt Thrower, which they've always had like left-leaning and very progressive views, as they were a part of like the UK grindcore scene for a bit, with like, Napalm Death and Carcass and such. There was conflict and tension, I'm assuming, between it. And from what you can see on the live footage, is that skinhead, neo-Nazi, whatever, was shouting at the band at Bolt Thrower. Bolt Thrower was shouting back, about to fight him. And then one of the audience members grabbed a pool stick and swung it over the head at that neo-Nazi. Thus, he passed out, and you can see him passed out on the floor with a pool of blood next to his head from this footage. And it's always been kind of like known that Bolt Thrower's really infamous show kind of led to this outcome. But quite interesting that when it comes to a band like Bolt Thrower, how they handle people like this. Instead of just like, shouting and parading as other bands do, they actually confront them. For this next inclusion, I need to credit Bakermancer for the Will Romer incident. Will Romer is the frontman to the brutal death grind band Mortician, and back in 2005 he hijacked a taxi in Poland. So as the story goes, from what I was able to gather from one article by Blabbermouth, is after performing a show in Poland, Will Romer would then hail a taxi to get to the German-Poland border. It's just he hijacked it by threatening the taxi driver with a knife. And when he got to the border, he was then detained by police. And from what I also gather, he spent somewhere around like 3 months in jail in Poland. But other than that, I couldn't find any information as to why he would do such a thing. So if anyone knows exactly as to why Will Romer would hijack a taxi to get to the German-Poland border, definitely let me know in the comments. And closing out Tier 4, credits go to Fastmod LFO Demon for Pat O'Brien being arrested in 2018. As I'm sure most of you guys know, Pat O'Brien was the long-running guitar player to Cannibal Corpse, as I believe he joined the band back in 1997 and left in 2020, as I'm assuming he was kicked out, because in 2018 he was arrested for house burglary and assaulting a police officer. And from what I was able to gather, that incident happened because he was at a neighbor's house, he was told to leave, he didn't, there was conflict, and that event ended up happening. Regardless, when he was arrested and the police went through his house and personal belongings, they came across like 50 shotguns, a dozen semi-automatic rifles, 20 or so pistols, a flamethrower, thousands of rounds of ammunition because, you know, Florida. And the real kicker that people tend to point out is that he was in possession of 3 human skulls, which I know at face value on paper that sounds insane to have that, but in actuality, at least from my own personal experiences, they're not the most impossible thing to get, as there are websites that it's totally legal that you can buy and own human bones. I mean, I'm one of them. Okay, and with that, we move down another level in this Iceberg chart to the second to last tier. Tier number 5, crimes. Yep, pretty self-explanatory what this tier is all going to be about, and I know in the previous tier some of those inclusions were crimes committed, but they were more in a ludicrous kind of way that when you read upon them you go like, oh my god, what the hell, and like laugh a little bit, whereas with these crimes, there's no laughing matter. This is really dark, twisted stuff of like serious kinds of crimes that deal with murder. Discharged by Death was a brutal death metal band based out of New Mexico that made a brutal death metal album in a prison. This is a band I've talked about a handful of times already here on my channel, so this is like a given to include it here. But yes, Discharged by Death, from what I remember, there are 3 members. One member is someone named Dirty Sanchez, who's not incarcerated. The other 2 members, who do the guitar, vocals, and I think bass guitar, they are incarcerated. And of the 2 members, there's Jason, who is incarcerated for second-degree murder and sexually assaulting a woman. And the other member, Torch, is incarcerated for first-degree murder, as the story goes with him from what I remember, and it's been changed, but when it was updated a few years ago, was that he was at a bar, he saw a man try to come onto a girl, and she was trying to avoid him, and he apprehended that man by killing him and then setting him on fire. Thus, his nickname is Torch. But yes, quite the oddball of a, mix of a lineup to have those 2 work together, but I guess when you're in prison, you can't really be picky about who wants to join your band. But yes, Discharged by Death, it actually is a legit brutal death metal album made in a prison by convicts. And for the most part, if you are into brutal death metal, it'll have all the tropes and attributes you would want. It's really, surprisingly, pretty good considering it's made in a prison out of all things. Cell Block Autopsy is another band done by Torch, the vocalist to Discharged by Death. What's different here is that the lineup doesn't include Jason, but another convict in the same prison. Again, he's serving for second-degree murder. You know, just tends to be a theme with some of the bands done by Torch, but again, you can't be picky starting brutal death metal bands in prison. But for the most part, instrumentally, it's just a continuation of Discharged by Death. It's just the lineup is different. But I'm only showing the band logo because the album artwork is a bit grotesque and God forbid YouTube might take it down. So for the sake of the longevity, I'm just showing the band logo. But yes, if you want more stuff like Discharged by Death, Cell Block Autopsy is the next best thing. And the final inclusion when it comes to anything relating to Torch is that, believe it or not only does he do brutal death metal bands in prison, he also does album artwork as well, as there's a handful of bands that play in the style of brutal death metal that has used his artwork for their album covers. One band in particular would be Lividity. Retaliation, Death from the Inside. I'm going to breeze by through this one pretty quickly because, About a year ago, I did a video all about this band and release, so if you want a more in-depth description, watch this video. But for the most part, Retaliation, Death from the Inside, this was a very, very short-lived death thrash band based out of Gardner, Massachusetts, and they recorded this album in the Gardner State Prison. All 4 members were convicts, by the way, for various crimes, and one of the programs at this prison was allowed to have music theory training, so they were able to play instruments, and they used that program to record this demo. So yeah, another death metal release made in a prison, and it's really rough around the edges, but what would you expect from convicts recording a death metal album in a prison? Joe Franklin was the guitar player to the Black Death doom metal band Goat Lord. In October 2nd, 2015, he gunned down his neighbor, abducted his 8-year-old son, shot him, and then himself. And other than that, I never really looked into the context as to why he did any of that, as it's just so incredibly blunt, bleak, and grim that there's no context to justify doing something like that at any point. All that I came across is that on the Metal Archives with his profile, as the trivia aspect about him, it states that he was an administrator for the website called Blood Shows, which was apparently a snuff website. So all I can gather from that is just there was something very, very mentally wrong with this guy. For this next inclusion, credits go to these 2 individuals for helping me discover this one. But Eric Shute was one of the vocalists of the brutal death metal band Pyrexia, as they've gone through quite a handful throughout their existence, as he was the vocalist for them up for like the mid-2000s up until the early 2010s. But back in 2016, he was arrested for being an accessory to 3 shootings in West Virginia. And as he was convicted, he is serving, I believe, 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The Beasts of Satan, another one that I'm going to breeze by through really quickly because I did a video all about them a year ago, so if you want a more in-depth description, watch my video on it. But the Beasts of Satan were like this collective of musicians that were a part of all different extreme metal bands in Italy, such as Veracity and another band called Nobody. And they were essentially extreme metal musicians that were serial killers. And as I stated, if you want a more in-depth description about all their crimes and what happened, watch my video on it. Credits to Cookie Wojo Nick for this next inclusion, but Agonizing Terror was a brutal death metal band based out of Portugal that, as the story goes, the vocalist was in a relationship with the drummer, and the drummer convinced her boyfriend, who was the vocalist of Agonizing Terror, to murder his parents. And after doing so, when he was arrested, their relationship ended, and the girl ended up dating one of the prison guards when that man went to prison. It's something that I've just recently discovered because of this comment, which I'll look more into in the coming weeks and maybe do a video about, but totally caught me off guard that I've never heard of this band or this story. And finally, closing out Tier 5 on a, I don't know if you could call this more comedic or ridiculous note, but Alan West used to be the guitar player for Obituary when they were doing the album Slowly Rewrought, and even played guitar for 6 Feet Under for a handful of years, so clearly integrated it with the Florida death metal scene that's regarded in high praise. Well, in 2013, he was arrested after being busted for basically making meth in his own house, like on a Breaking Bad level type of crime here, that I just always found to be like so obscure and random. When I was just getting into death metal, I came across this story, and I remember just thinking, like, what am I getting myself into? With that all addressed, we have finally reached the bottom of this Iceberg chart, the last tier, that being Tier 6, Forbidden Knowledge. In this final tier, there really isn't any theme going on here per se, but more so we have reached the point now of just absolute peak lunacy, where there's going to be things here that are mysterious and unanswered that leave a lot of debate and questions going on. Other inclusions really might test your overall understanding of death metal, and others that I just think are really bizarre. I didn't know where to put them, and the more I thought about them, the more I thought they belong at the absolute bottom. North Korean death metal. If you search that up, one of the results will be here on YouTube called a band Red War. It's in the style of brutal death metal, and this demo runs for roughly around 10 minutes long. And in terms of the songwriting and overall sound, it has all those components that sounds pretty good. The thing is, however, the more you think about it, this is supposedly a band, regardless of genre, coming from North Korea, which is characterized as this totalitarian state. There's a lot of mystery behind it in terms of its information as to what's true and what's false and fabricated, yada yada yada. I know that's like a rabbit hole for a completely different channel and topic, but when you think about it, it's just how does someone from North Korea with such limited freedoms make something like this, considering there's nothing else coming out of that country? And the more you start questioning it, the more it doesn't seem possible that this is legit, which more than likely it isn't, because throughout some of the comments I read, people started pointing out that the music from this band Red War is a direct ripoff from a death grind band from Canada called Anomalies. So more than likely this is a fabricated, made up band, but just kind of interesting to kind of, play along with the, mindset of like, what if a North Korean death metal band existed? Once again, credits go to Bakermancer for this next inclusion, and this is all about Necrovore. For those who know of Necrovore, I'm pretty sure you're aware they are viewed as this obscure hidden gem when it comes to 1980s death metal, as they only did 2 demos, but for what they're worth, they're incredibly well done, and I would love to score copies if, they weren't all freaking bootlegs, as it's impossible to find legit copies of Necrovore merchandise. Regardless, what makes them being included here is not because they're an obscure name, but the vocalist / guitarist of Necrovore was a massive supporter and critic to Morbid Angel during their early days. And at one point, the vocalist of Necrovore tried convincing Trey Azagoth and David Vincent from Morbid Angel to join Necrovore before they would record their debut full-length album, Morbid Angel's, Altars of Madness. However, Trey and David decided to pursue Morbid Angel and nothing came of it. It's just, when you think about it, if everything worked out for Necrovore, it's a big what if Trey and David joined Necrovore, I feel like the way we talk about Morbid Angel, how we praise Morbid Angel as these big essential innovators, well, if it worked out for Necrovore, we'd be saying all of that, but to Necrovore instead. Credits go to Alan666, one of my Instagram followers, for telling me about this. But the vocalist for the death metal band Necrophagia, Killjoy, co-directed, co-wrote, and starred in the horror exploitation film August Underground Mortem, which I've seen the original August Underground, and they have like a few sequels after it, Mortem being one of them, that if it's anything like the original, it's quite the tough watch, as it's in this found footage following around a crazy man that makes snuff films basically, and is all about torture that's really gross. I'll just leave it at that. And just again, quite interesting for such an extreme film franchise series, I guess, that it would involve someone in death metal like the vocalist of Necrophagia. Oh, and I also forgot to mention, with the DVD release of August Underground Mortem, in the special features, it also includes a live performance of Necrophagia, so that's cool. Macabre, the death thrash grindcore band, takes photos with John Wayne Gacy, which is a pretty blunt inclusion here. There's nothing mysterious about it. It's just, when it comes to Macabre, I know a lot of their lyrical themes have to do with serial killers, crimes. It's just they do it with a black comedy edge and twist with it. It's just, there's something about these band photos with John Wayne Gacy, seeing them smile and putting their arm around him, that I don't know, it just turns my blood cold, and I just felt like it had to be included here. The Mystery of Damar. Damar is a band I have talked about a handful of times on my channel. It's a Lebanon extreme metal band that blends forms of black metal and death metal together in that like war metal territory. That in my video explaining Damar, I even stated like what happened to these guys, and all these years later I'm still left questioning that, as I have gotten messages and comments telling me about what may have happened to some of the members, like they left Lebanon, they went back to Lebanon, they converted to Islam, or they truly stayed away from it. One of the members went to Australia, another started a pop punk band. I've heard so many different stories, and I don't know if we'll ever get any types of answers as to what happened to them, as it seems they've gone like off grid. They've never done any represses for their vinyl, and while there are fans making bootleg merchandise of their shirts, which is really cool to see them gain like some kind of traction, other than that, it's just like a total mystery as what happened to them all of these years later. The true identity to the Curator, the vocalist of Portal. I make it no secret that I am a diehard Portal fan. I mean, whenever I have the opportunity to announce how much I enjoy them, I do it without hesitation. Yet even I don't know who the identity of the Curator is. Because if you search up everyone else affiliated with Portal, like the guitarist, bassist, rhythm guitar, drummer, whatever, you'll come across either like a first name, maybe their whole name, other bands that they've been a part of. Yet with the Curator, there's nothing. And you can't find any info about who he is. And what I'm about to say next can be just boiled down to just trust me, bro, because I'm about to say some of my own personal experiences. But back in 2016 on my personal Facebook, I got a friend request from a guy who, in his banner and basic information, was like, he's a part of Portal. Turns out, who I accepted was the vocalist of Portal. I don't remember his name, and even if I did, I wouldn't state it here, because truly he's trying to remain anonymous to some degree if he's putting all this, I guess, effort into doing so. But I've seen him in a photo once without, like the mask and all the other cloak stuff. And then he just kind of like deleted it a week after, and that was it. But it's just really fascinating to me, a band like Portal that's pretty well known when it comes to Australian death metal. They've done some international success, they've toured, they've done festivals. And again, if you keep up with underground death metal, they're a name that you'll come across. To this day, being active for over 30 years, there's still no information about the true identity of the Curator. The first death growl. When you think of death metal, one of its signature sounds is the vocals labeled as death growls. And you would think when it comes to the first death growls, it would happen with the first death metal bands like Possessed or Death, or any bands formed around that time in the early to mid 80s. When in actuality, when you think of the components and sounds of death growls, it stretches back a little bit further. As in 1966, the rock band The Who did a song called Boris the Spider. And if you listen to it, as it's only 2.5 minutes long, you'll notice during the chorus there are some pretty creepy, like throaty vocals being executed that roughly resemble the styles of a death growl. So when we look at it in actuality, the first death growl comes from The Who back in 1966. And the final inclusion for the Death Metal Lore Iceberg chart is something that I felt like I needed to include here because it's been bothering me now for a year, and hopefully one day this can get answered. But last year, the film The Substance was released, and I absolutely fell in love with this movie. I remember watching it with my wife in theaters, and we were just in awe at just the spectacle and grotesque body horror that ensues in this film. I'm not going to spoil much for you guys, but it's a really creative, incredible, crazy film that the first time I watched it, as I stated, we were just in awe. Loved it so much I wanted to watch it a second time, which we did. And I started picking up on other little cues in the film that went over my head. And I noticed during the climax of the film, there is this brief moment of like 10 or 15 seconds that you can hear some down-tuned guitars being played really fast and blast beats continuing with it. And I realized, hey, is that death metal being played? I wonder what band it is. Whatever. pretty cool. The third time I ended up watching the film, I anticipated for that one part thinking, alright, I don't notice who that is, but maybe in the credits of the film, I'll find it. Because I'm that much of a nerd, I sat through the credits of The Substance waiting for something to pop up that would cue me in on who the musicians were. Again, nothing came of it. So I ended up buying the soundtrack, which, if you know the film, the packaging for this is just absolutely incredible and I absolutely love it. Nothing in here has anything to do with that part, as this is all done by Rapper T, the electronic producer who did all the electronic music for the soundtrack. Great stuff, but nothing of like that death metal, 10-second clip is featured on this soundtrack. So looking up online, there's nothing you can find except for one little cue. That being that apparently that 10-second part is called the Punishment Song, and it's done by these two musicians here, but I couldn't find it anywhere online or on YouTube of this part, because again, it's only 10 or 15 seconds, and I've always just wondered, like, what was the point for like this one, 10-second death metal clip in a film that's like highly praised. It got nominated for like in the Academy Awards for Best Picture, and I just find it fascinating that there's this brief little snippet of death metal instrumentation being played on The Substance, and there's no information as to who really did it. And it's just always like boggled my mind, because as of right now, The Substance has been like one of my favorite films that I've watched over and over again. I plan to watch it again because it just entertains me so much. But yeah, going a little bit off topic here, definitely watch The Substance, and if anyone has any information about that part, please let me know. And that'll do it for the Death Metal Lore Iceberg chart. I had so much fun making this. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I can't thank you all enough for commenting on the community post to help expand this with all the entries all the more, because it really helped. And again, I just cannot thank each and one of you guys enough for doing so. Other than that, the reason as to why I want to do this Death Metal Lore Iceberg chart is not only is it just really fun, but roughly around 2 weeks ago, my Black Metal Lore video got taken down by YouTube because it was against community standards after 3 years of being up. And thankfully I got it disputed that now it's up, but it's age restricted. But during that whole fiasco, when I was telling you guys about it in the community post, I really just got nothing but positive comments by you guys telling me to either redo the Black Metal Lore Iceberg chart or do it the same exact way and do like a redux with more additions, which is really encouraging to hear you guys enjoy it that much. Which, if you guys enjoyed this one, the Death Metal Lore Iceberg chart, enough, maybe down the road in the near future I'll do a revitalized version of the Black Metal Lore Iceberg chart, if that sounds appealing. But other than that, again, I'll state it here once more. Thank you all so much for helping me with this video, as it just really helped make this video all the better in my personal view. But yeah, enough with me rambling on about that. Other than that, guys, like always, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.